Alright, hello everyone. It's been a little while, and I thought I would continue with my um, kind of my series of videos dealing with China. And I finished reading on the Qing, and I decided before I jumped into the Ming that I'd read a book on a little bit more topical, a little bit more contemporary, on a topic that is quite a bit more relevant to libertarianism generally, and that is a book about the famine under Mao. The name of the book is Hungry Ghosts, Mao's Secret Famine by Jasper Becker. That's Jasper Becker. Hungry Ghost, Mao's Secret Famine. This is a book I learned about probably 8 years ago. I don't think he must be retired by now, but there's a doctor with a radio show by the name of Stanley Monteith who had a show. I think he had his own radio show for a long time. It's been probably broadcast on lots of the kind of conspiracy networks. And I only listened to one episode of his show ever, and he probably cited 20 books in just 2-3 hours. And I purchased several of them, including he's the one who first alerted me to Anthony C. Sutton and the Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development books. What else? He recommended Bob Baer, a book about Saddam Hussein called Unholy Babylon, a couple other good books, and this is one of them that he had suggested, and I kind of filed it away in my mind. I wasn't able to find it when I first learned about it. It wasn't until several years later that I found it on Amazon, and then a few years after that I finally bought it. I bought it this spring, I think in May, and decided to read it. Now, it's important because it's used by libertarians, and even non-libertarians for that matter, as an example of what can happen when you have government control of something, the disasters that can ensue. It is likely, although not definitively, it is likely the largest famine in terms of the total number of people who died in history. Likely. Unfortunately, there's a lot of gaps in our knowledge, and getting anything close to an accurate estimate is very problematic. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I think the first thing to point out is that famine in China is not a new thing, and that it's probably unfair to say, okay, Mao Zedong and the communists take over in 1949. So if there's any famine after that, that proves communism fails. Famine has been happening in China as long as we know. The first historic dynasty, the Shang dynasty, I think I have some of their books here, but yeah. Shang civilization. The first tombs that we have of them, talk about there being famines, and in the post-imperial period right after the Qing dynasty failed in 1911, China became a smorgasbord for Western anthropologists and historians and archaeologists. In fact, a lot of times when you learn about the studies of China, a lot of it's coming from the 19-teens, 1920s, and the early 1930s, because that's an era when it was really opened up. It didn't have a strong central government at all, really, or even any central government for that matter. And Westerners were able basically to bribe their way in, and there's an interesting, pretty quickly they learned that famine was quite common in Chinese history. In fact, to the point where from the time of the Shang until the end of the Qing, so a 2,000-year period, they counted no less than 1,900 major and distinct famines, so approximately close to one per year, slightly less. Of course, assuming that there were very likely not records for some of them. So, to an extent, one has to say, okay, well, no matter who was in charge, there's a good chance there would have been a famine in China. And so that in and of itself is hardly strong evidence against communism. However, the way it looks is it was probably not just a famine, it was likely the worst famine that has ever befallen China. And also differed in scope. I'm not exactly sure. It probably has something to do with the climate and the ecology of the region, but the major agricultural regions in China tend to be centered on these river valleys, the Yangtze, the Yellow, and their tributaries, a few others. And these rivers apparently are much less consistent than, say, the Nile or the Tigris and the Euphrates or some of the other major rivers that have ancient civilizations based on them. You know, the Nile flooded very regularly every year in a very predictable way. I don't believe the Tigris and the Euphrates really flood that much at all. They have a consistent water flow most of the year, or at least not so inconsistent as to be difficult. The Yellow and the Yangtze River, flood and or dry up, not totally, but recede quite a bit. And also China's a good deal more continental climate, and is, even though it touches the ocean, is prone to having very cold, dry spells in the winter, and droughts and things like that are, I guess, less common in the other civilization belts. And so, it's had more than its fair share of famine. In fact, some of the people who have studied it have kind of said, look, at any given point, there's tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of people in China who are just barely surviving. And he described it as a person treading water, and just their faces above water, and just a little ripple is enough to drown them, or at least cause them enormous suffering. Now, in the dynastic period, the governments basically ostensibly tried to prevent this, and what they did is something that sounds reasonable, and I think a lot of people could be misled into thinking, hey, this is a really good idea, because what they would do is they would establish granaries, and the idea being, okay, well, we have a bumper crop, or when we have a surplus, we'll store it in the granary, and then when there's a deficit because of a drought or a flood or whatever, or a war, then we'll have this stored up, and we'll be able to alleviate the suffering of the population. That sounds good. But there's a couple things about it that seem a little bit fishy. One, if you look at the first of all, the net effect of government on famine is probably negative, or because even when they're transporting grain to and from, there's a transaction cost that's pretty considerable. But one of the main causes of famine, other than the weather, and the weather probably is the biggest, are things that are explicitly state-caused, especially war. War is the number one casualty of war in China and many places over history is actually famine. It's an indirect and sometimes a direct result of the conflict itself. So of those 2,000 famines, one has to wonder how many of the famines and how many of the people died because of a war that is essentially the fault of the government, which I suppose you might say not every war is necessarily the fault of the government, but the lion's share certainly of them all are. Another is, if you look at the infrastructure designed to alleviate famine, it's clear that it's actually designed more to ingratiate the government. Things like the Grand Canal, a very famous public works project, I believe created primarily by the Song dynasty, but then maintained in subsequent dynasties. I might have that wrong, so don't quote me. It's been around a long time, I know that. Maybe it was the Ming, who knows. That is designed to transport grain from the south, not to the poorest farmers in the north, but to the political capital, Beijing, or Peking, or whatever the city was at the time. And it's clearly, this is delivering grain to the government, and then the government can dispense with it. And when you have a population that could be starving or is starving, the ability to control the food is the power of life and death. it is also interesting to think that peasants giving their grain to the state somehow is making them safer than if they were to retain the grain themselves or dispose of it themselves. There's a couple other interesting aspects in how I think the Imperial China had negative effects on famine. One is the tax system. One thing you come across a lot is the fact that the agriculture in China was strained because they would have to keep planting and replanting every year, actually sometimes multiple times a year, on plots of land when everyone knows, and they knew this in China even back then, that you have lower and lower yields unless you can allow fields to rest, unless you can allow them to sit fallow. But typically, this was especially true during the Qing, taxes are assessed based on land. And so if you have 2 acres of land, 10 acres of land, whatever, you're getting taxed on that, so you can't afford to have half of it be fallow every second or third year. Even though you might be able to feed yourself and you'll have greater yields in the long run, you're getting a grain assessment in taxes, and if you don't cultivate your entire plot, then the assessment in taxes is going to be so much of what you do actually produce in any given year that you're likely starve or at least be much poorer. So there's that. Also, this only applies to the later Qing. One thing, and this is not true just in China, typically famines historically have been relatively localized events. Given the costs in transit, you could have one valley literally have a good crop, and then a valley over have a poor harvest, and there would still be starvation, even though if you combine the two, there would be enough food. And the simple fact that communications made it difficult and transportation made it difficult and expensive meant that the surplus in one wasn't going to be able to meet the demand in another. In China, this is a legitimate difficulty that's so mountainous in much of the country that the only real means to move goods historically, and this is even to a little bit still true today, is with manpower, like literally people carrying it, which not only is very inefficient, it's extremely expensive. If you're going to have a guy carry a 50-pound or 100-pound bag of rice, let's just say, 200 miles, he's going to have to eat a big part of the bag just to make it, plus the pay he would have to receive. So ideas like the canals, they make sense, but I don't think that if you subject them to any kind of Benthamite cost-benefit analysis of what's the ideal distribution in terms of production of rice or grain and other crops to areas that need it most, that it just so happens that it's always to bring it to the capital. The stuff is always sent to the political center. It's like, if you look at in terms of defensive strategy, it's amazing how much defensive investment there is around the political capitals of nations, and one would get the impression that that's the key strategically to those places, when it's clear this is demonstrating a state interest and not necessarily a social interest. But late in the Qing, there were actually Westerners who began approaching them saying they would like to build railroads, probably for profit. They would own the railroads and charge. And the Qing actually did not allow this, and I don't know the reason. I imagine they had some kind of xenophobic fear. Maybe they thought that potential rebels would be able to use it. Typically, things like railroads and roads have been used by central authorities, central states, to control their hinterlands, but for some reason the Qing prevented this, and so the late 19th century, which should have been a period where China would become more able to cope with famines, its ability to cope with famines didn't really increase, and the absolute certain worst famine in history, if we don't count the Mao one, was in China in the 1870s. I don't know if there's a name for that, but a massive, massive famine, larger probably than the ones in the Ukraine or in the USSR, second only in all likelihood to Mao's famine. And there was many more after that, although not quite as large. Major famines during the war with Japan, during the nationalist period, and one has to wonder how what the net positive effect of supposed dynastic attempts to prevent famine. Another interesting thing is, let's just to say, I kind of got on a huge tangent there, I'm sorry, but these big granaries that are supposed to gather the surplus in bumper crop years and then distribute it, it makes perfect sense, if you don't think about it. But there's two big problems with that in practice mean that they're probably much more harm than good. And one is the incentive problem. You suddenly have these very valuable granaries that are in the control of bureaucrats within the imperial government, and later in Mao we'll see. And they have enormous incentives to distribute that in a way that is beneficial to them, to give it to their allies, to give it to their friends, and to sell it to the highest bidder, to resell it, or to not just give it out philanthropically, because doing so requires time and money. And so very often what would happen is they would become enriched, or the grain would just rot. A lot of grain that was sent to the state rotted. Needlessly rotted. I mean, you're going to get some. I think even today it's something like a third of all agricultural products are destroyed in the field by funguses and bacteria and whatnot, blights of some sort or another. I don't know if that's still the case, but I was told that in college, and it was an agricultural college, so he must have been right. I don't know. But there's a very strong incentive to abuse that. Now, people think, oh, he's a bureaucrat, they're there, it's the government, they're there to help. The government bureaucrat, how he is rewarded is not based on how good he helps the people. It's based on how much he pleases his superior, who is, in most cases, just a higher ranking bureaucrat. And once you get towards the top, in today's society, it's an elected politician. Historically, it's usually some kind of dynastic monarch. That's who butters their bread, so to speak. So it doesn't matter how much you actually help the peasants in our hypothetical Chinese province or prefecture. It's how happy you make the emperor. And to a large extent, you're able to lie to the emperor and just tell him what he wants to hear. And if he sends somebody to come and check up on you, it's very easy to bribe that person as well and say, okay, you can walk out of here with a year's wages and you just give a good report. That kind of stuff is actually cliche in how common it was in China. There's a couple high-ranking bureaucrats who, the most infamous example was the one by the name of Henshin. And I want to say he was enormously personally wealthy. He was a eunuch. And there's no contention anywhere that he did anything at all to help the people. But he was really good friends with the emperor. I think it was Emperor Qinlong. It might have been King Shi, but I think it was Qinlong. And, he's just, they're buddies. And when he talks to the emperor, there's a personal rapport. And the emperor's just like, look, I trust this guy, even though he's, he's one of the most infamously corrupt bureaucrats in the history of the world, and yet he's just an archetype of a very typical kind of person that you'd see, not just in China, but any bureaucracy. There's a very strong tendency to want to use the granaries then as a political weapon, to reward your allies, to punish your enemies. Also, they're always of secondary, helping the people is always secondary to state needs. So, and the big example here would be the military. If the military needs grain, then the granaries don't serve the interest. So you pay taxes to the granary, they take all your surplus, and sometimes, depending on the situation, all of your yield entirely, and then the army will just take all of it. That's always the danger. And the only way you get it back is with political strings attached. Now, let's assume that we have benevolent, altruistic bureaucrats who actually are saying, I have this granary, I'm going to use it in the best way to help the people, and although this person is rare, they do exist. they bump into the Hayekian knowledge problem of, okay, how do I do that? Who do I determine to should and should not get this? Do you means test it? It's difficult. If you say you're just going to give it to anybody who needs it, then everyone's going to say that they need it. Everyone's going to, even people who have their own crops are going to say, okay, I should just get the states for free. I'll keep my own and I'll be that much the better. So if you're going to try and means test it, you have to set up a rubric to do that. Do you means test who has to contribute? Do you means test who has to get it? How do you even determine if you're being defrauded? How do you determine, the relative needs, blah, blah, blah? How do you best distribute it? Do you do it all yourself? Do you just appoint your underlings to do it for you? Do you trust them not to take advantage? Very, very difficult problems. They're insoluble if by insoluble you mean that we're getting some kind of optimization. I think the best way you could say is you have the least bad, but you're still going to have bureaucratic friction. Even if everything is on the up and up and honest-wise, there's still an enormous loss. Suffice to say, dynasties in China have been trying to work this out for a very long time, and you could say that things would have been worse, but it's hard to see how, because there aren't any societies we know about that had this many famines over this long. Now, again, that is also a testament to the degree of records that we have. We know an awful lot about Chinese history. I don't think there's anywhere that we have so much information so consistently over such a long time, which isn't to say we have look, there are areas in Chinese history we don't know as much about. But, we look at Rome, we know an awful lot about Rome, but we call them the Dark Ages because, relatively speaking, there's a huge dip in what we know. In China, it's different. We have a very good idea. I'm not saying I do yet, but I'm getting there. And there's just famine after famine after famine. And I think a lot of this, have to say, well, that's the climate and that's the weather. It's just if you're going to have an agricultural society that's going to be based in the Yellow River Valley or the Yangtze River Valley or the Pearl River Valley or whatever, it's going to have famines, and if you have them in the Nile, it's going to be less frequent. I think that's fair. But all that being said, likely what happened in Mao's famine was worse. Now, here's a couple of the reasons why. One, China is a very large country, and it's a very ecologically diverse country. So you have basically deserts, semi-arid areas, a lot of mountainous areas, and then you have subtropical, even tropical areas in the south part of China. You do not and cannot have a universal weather pattern that is going to be universally bad, at least not in historic. You might say an ice age or something, but not in historic periods. You can have a drought in this or that river valley, in 5 or 6 or 7 provinces, not in all of them. And historically, famines have been, okay, this area, that area, not all of them put together. This is one way that Mao's famine was different. As best we can tell, there were famines everywhere. There are famines in Tibet, there are famines in Manchuria, there are famines in Shanghai, in Hainan, in Inner Mongolia. There are famines in Sichuan. Sichuan is the largest province by population in China today. I don't know if that was the case back then. It's one of the larger provinces by land area. It's probably something about the size of Alaska. It has over 100 million people in it, even now. And it has historically not had many famines. They've been relatively small, and yet they think we could be talking in just that one province. In Mao's famine, by the way, it takes place during the quote-unquote Great Leap Forward, and it takes place primarily in 1959 to 1960, and really the winter, January, the first couple months of 1960s when it's the worst. It alleviates somewhat, but it continues until 1962. I think the estimate that they gave in the book, which was, and I'll talk about this a little bit more. It's difficult to get good estimates, but we're talking probably a few million, maybe 9 or 10 million, just in that one province. And that's again a province that normally did not have famines. Many of the other ones that historically did have famines had, really terrible 20-30% sometimes likely numbers of people who starved to death. It is difficult, but given the relative scale and the best estimates of the population of China and the widespread nature of this famine, that's the basis for people concluding that it's the largest one in the world in history. I think it's not the most conservative estimate, because there are people out there saying it was only 3 million. I watched actually Maoist Rebel News' video about this, and he said it was only 3 million. So I'm going to say that's like the absolute communist propaganda lowball number. He says 3 million like it's something to be happy about. Most of the ones that I saw, and it wasn't just from this book, I looked other places, was 30 million. You do get numbers double and triple that. Alex Jones says 100 million. Okay. It's difficult to come up with a straight number. Now, I want to talk a little bit of the nature of this famine. What happened is the communists took power largely with the support of the peasants. Peasantry in China is different than the peasantry in Europe generally. There wasn't really anything like serfdom, at least in the late dynastic period. If you go way back to the Qin and the Han, I think there were feudal estates and that sort. By the time you get to the Ming and the Qing, that wasn't the case any longer. By the end of the Qing, 50% of all the land was owned by the peasants. The peasants owned their own land; they farmed their own land. Half of the remainder was farmed by people who they were renting, but they also owned their own plot. So 25% of the land was being farmed by a person who was renting it, but then that same person also owned their own bit of land. It wasn't a case where you had landholders owning millions of people or hundreds of thousands of acres or anything like that. That was actually quite unusual. It was a nation of small holders, very small holders. And similar to Russia, the way the communists came to power is they said, we're going to have land reform. If you're a tenant, if you're landless, or if you're a peasant who has a very small plot, we are going to shuffle things up and you're going to get more land. But communism doesn't believe in millions or hundreds of millions in the case of China of smallholders each owning their own plot. They believe in massive centralized planning, agro-cities, agricultural armies, mass collectivization. And what happened in China very much mirrored what happened in the Soviet Union, where you have, okay, we're going to get in power by promising the peasants that we're going to give them their own land, give them more land if they don't have very much, give them land that they're tilling if they're only renting it, which was relatively unusual in China. And then once they get in power, say, okay, now the state is going to own not only all the land, but all your labor, all your property, all your tools, all your draft animals, everything like that. It's very a monumental case of bait and switch. The most monumental case of bait and switch imaginable, really. Now, when the Soviet Union tried this under Stalin, it resulted in mass famine. Some of the famines under Stalin, I think, were intentional. And not long after they were implemented, they basically abandoned it. The state still retained ownership of most everything nominally, and a large part of things effectively, but then they also said, okay, we'll allow certain areas to be privately basically run, and we'll allow some markets in food production, and that's where most of the food in the Soviet Union was coming from, if they weren't importing it from Cargill. The Chinese system was similar. They win the revolution because Chiang was a douche, and was also exhausted by a long war with Japan. I'm not going to carry any water for Chiang, but everything would have been better if he had not lost, compared to what happened anyway. And once the Mao was secure in power, he decided he wanted to jump into this great leap forward. The idea with the great leap forward is that they would reach socialism, that they would reach actual true communism. They'd go through the steps of whatever, democratic socialism, socialism, and then communism. And then there was kind of this, we're going to get there before the Soviet Union. We're going to reach this ideological Marxism before the Soviet Union. Now, one thing about the communists is that they're pitiless against their class enemies. And peasants are not Marxists. Peasants want to own, if they don't own their land, they want to own their land. If they do own their land, they want to own a little bit more. AKA, they like private property, they want to own their own land. If you come and promise them you're going to give them all these goodies, they might support you, but they don't think in terms of, I want to be a cog in a agro army. They want to own their own land. They are, and he gives some quotes from Lenin, basically the effect that, look, they're inherently capitalistic. And there are some quotes in here from some Chinese communists saying, look, peasants, they're not our allies. We'll lie to them, but socialism is going to come from the proletariat. It's going to come from the urban workers, and those are the people who are going to be the vanguard leading the way into communism. And the peasants, they're useful idiots at best, and counter-revolutionary rightist capitalists at the worst. So Maoist Rebel News goes to a great deal to emphasize the fact that this famine is not intentional. However many people died, it wasn't on purpose. Which that could be, but given how much communists hate smallholders and hate private property owners, in whatever form they come, and peasants tend to be private property owners, especially in China, I don't think we can take it for granted that they maybe didn't intend to actually kill lots of people. I think that there is a possibility, although I don't think it can be proven, I don't think it's necessary to in it either, that there was an idea that, look, these peasants are in the way. They were trying to set up basically a socialist welfare state in the cities, so when they were allocating grain, cities got more, party members got more, Confucian peasants, they didn't get as much. Also, if they're starving, they're not revolting. If you are starving to death, literally, if you have edema, if you're eating your children, that's a whole side topic, by the way, you're likely not leading a peasant uprising against the government. I think that was a big part of, that could have been a big part of the motivation here. Not saying that it was. It's very difficult to know what was in these people's minds. A lot of records were destroyed and a lot of records were never made. But this is interesting, the whole, it's not really bad because it wasn't intentional. What does that say about a system that it can unintentionally, when it's trying to help people, cause minimum, and this is Maoist Rebel News' estimate, 3 million deaths? Like, how is that exactly an endorsement? And that estimate is, I think, that's propaganda. But even if we accept that, it's interesting. In the book, it talks about how people would get recruited into the communist armies, and these socialist Chinese, who themselves were probably just one step above ignorant, would go and say, there's one country in the world where the poor people have all the food they can eat, and they would tell them that's the Soviet Union. And this is like, this is at the time when Soviet Union's starving to death. They're eating grain that's made out of sawdust and bark. And there is a country in the world where the poor were like fat, like literally fat, and it wasn't the Soviet Union, it was the United States. But these people were so, this is interesting how many people, history is just, there's so many of these examples of these people going off, fighting, dying for something that is obviously false. It's not funny, but I'm laughing anyway. Like, oh, and this reminds me, when they talk about what the communists were thinking, Mao had all these ideas about what communist agriculture would be. He didn't necessarily come up with everything. It's not like he sat there and designed the way the communes were going to be from ground up. He had ideas, he talked about it, but it was relatively vague and not nearly comprehensive in the sense that you would actually be able to plan something based on that. it got implemented because other party members went ahead and said, okay, this is what he said. Let's do my best to make that happen. But it's interesting, they had these very grandiose pronouncements that nobody will have to work. Like, nobody will have to work. Everyone will just, or maybe people will have to work 2 or 3 hours a week. And then the rest of the time will be devoted to leisure. You can go to plays. You can do art. You can do music. You can go swimming. We'll have machines that will do the work for us for everything. The machines will even serve us. And we'll do all of it with science. Does anyone else... I was reading, I think it's in chapter 2 of this book. Does that sound familiar to anybody else? Because it sounded exactly like a totally non-communist, very trendy religion on YouTube these days. And, when you tell those people that they're communists, they look at you like, what are you talking about? When like, Mao Zedong and Jacques Fresco are so ideologically similar, it's funny. And it's interesting how they're science, but then anybody who's like, okay, well, how exactly is that going to work? Like, what it's like, hey, don't be a downer, like, don't be counter-revolutionary. So some of his ideas about agriculture were included deep sowing. So the idea is you don't just dig a little trench and put the seeds in it. You dig like a 5-foot deep crater, and then you put the seeds in the bottom, and then you bury it, and just wait for a rainforest to grow. And then another one was communism. You want the seeds to work together, so you want to bunch them as close together. So you don't want to spread them out. You want to take all your seeds and put them in a really small area, and then they'll help each other grow. And the peasants knew better than this. They said that's a bad idea. And then the cop party people say, if you don't plant them that way, we're going to kill you. And it doesn't matter. So they actually had yields. Some of the yields were probably, they'd plant 100 pounds of seeds and get 1 pound back. That's the kind of science that they were engaged in. They'd also tell people, look, just go out and build a dam. And the peasants would go and dam a river with a pile of dirt, and a year later it would collapse and 1 million people would die. I mean, that actually happened. The worst flooding ever from a dam break was in the 70s in China, because they didn't care about the science. They said, let's just go ahead and build this shit because we have the fervor to do it. And I think more than 1 million people died. I don't remember the name, but it happened on a smaller scale countless times beyond that. So they launch this great leap forward. They have enforced collectivization. They don't even allow people to cook in their own kitchens. Everyone has to work and communal thing. Obviously, there's a huge incentive problem. The government officials, rather than say, okay, look, we're not having very good yields, we're not having good results, they know that they rise and fall based on how happy Mao is and Mao's subordinates. And so they tell Mao what he wants to hear. And Mao wants to hear how the Great Leap Forward is causing there to be huge grain yields. And Maoist Rebel News talked about this also. He's like, look, the state was, this is what happened. They'd have a very small grain yield because of these stupid ideals. But they'd lie and say that they had a huge grain yield, and then the government would say, okay, well, we're going to take all the grain because you have such, you produced 100 million tons. We're going to take 50 million tons. It's all fine. When there was only 40 million tons to begin with, they just taxed everything, which they would then send to the Soviet Union to pay for their huge debt to that country. And Maoist Rebel News actually talked about this, and he's like, well, they were just lying, you can't blame. Well, that's the incentive for a government bureaucrat, whether it's communism or not, is to tell their superior what they want to hear. Ultimately, they have usually a pretty strong influence on how the higher-ups even comprehend what's going on. You could say, well, the higher-ups will just check, but they're going to check by having the lower bureaucrats tell them what's really happening. Their main source of information is the lower bureaucrats, the lower bureaucracy. And so they're going to be told what they want to hear. The lower bureaucracy is totally incentivized to say, oh, you're and Mao liked this. Mao liked it when people would come and say your ideas are working. And when people came and said people are starving to death by the millions, in some cases, he didn't. That didn't make his ego feel nice, and he would just say, I'm not listening to you. I'm not going to promote you. In fact, he might execute you, although it didn't typically happen like right away or anything. But he'd write your name down, and a couple years later, during the Cultural Revolution, you'd be in serious trouble. You might not die, but a lot of them did. And that's what happened. There were people in the Communist Party in China who were like, this isn't working, and they started allowing a little bit more market stuff to happen. Ultimately, the most probably powerful person who did this was Liu Shaoqi, who was the president. For a while, Mao wasn't even in charge of the government nominally. He was just head of the party. And he started saying this isn't working. And apparently some of his family members starved to death, which he didn't even know until later. He went to visit his hometown and like, hey, your uncle died. He starved to death. He was eating bark and he died. He got constipated by eating mud and he couldn't poop and he died. That happened quite a bit apparently. And he was like, whoa, maybe we should rethink this whole collectivization thing. And he wasn't killed. He was eventually put in prison and he died of cancer. Deng Xiaoping is probably another one, but he was quiet about it during Mao's lifetime. He took over later. He basically, and this is interesting, Mao's Rebel News said, look, since this famine, which he admits, okay, if Mao's Rebel News admits there's a famine, there's a fucking famine. He goes, since this famine, there hasn't been any other famines. But this is the same guy who will lambaste China nonstop for having gone to the rightist, for having gone capitalist, because it has. Relatively speaking, I mean, if Li Shaoqi is a rightist capitalist, then Deng Xiaoping is Ludwig von Mises. And China has gone, they have abolished the collective systems of agriculture totally. So it's interesting that because he was Mao's Rebel News, and this isn't going to be a video response to him or anything like that. Just, I'm juxtaposing what is the most ideologically opposite view of my own. He's like, oh, look, Mao worked because there hasn't been a famine in China since then. And as far as I know, there was still a famine, especially in places like Tibet, into the 70s and 80s, but not like the Mao's famine, and not like the historical famines before that. There hasn't been famines though in China since at least 1980 and before. Of course, Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1979, and the collectives were dismantled before that, even before Mao was dead. Mao's Rebel News, like many true communists, would lament the mass capitalization, free market, onslaught, rightist turn in China, and yet then he goes, oh, but there hasn't been any famine. That's because of Mao. Well, no, China went to the capitalists, so to speak. CCP is still in power, but they don't do, and that's the thing. Once you start looking at China, Marxist Leninism, it's like it's the wallpaper. It's not it's not something that's actually directing the ideology of the state. Now, that's not to say the state's okay. I mean, the state is motivated by a very natural, nationalistic, very authoritarian bent that's bad in all sorts of other ways, but it's not communist, and so there's plenty of food. There hasn't been famine in China, even though the population has risen, even though there's more population around it. But if you look at the actual grain yields during Mao, the per person, per unit of land production of grains during the Great Leap was less than it was during the Han Dynasty 2,000 years before. That's pathetically terrible. That's what you get when your ideology about dialectical materialism is more important than agricultural science, or the market for that matter. And they haven't been trying to do collectives since then, and they've been okay. We haven't had famines in China since then. We have them in North Korea still, which hasn't gone to the capitalists just yet. And actually, the postscript of this book is about North Korea. I think this book is written in 98 or published in 98. So the famine in North Korea is just then happening. and the author that wasn't really in the news, I don't think, but he was sensitive to it. So interesting chapter in history. He goes into the estimates. There's lots of people who fled, would go to Hong Kong or wherever and say there's famine, family starving. And it's very easy to kind of say, okay, well, there's a bias there. Those are people who are running away. But there's also a great deal of consistency, and there have been people since then, even today, who go back and ask people, do you remember these times? And we get consistent stories of people dying in the street. There's photographic documentation of that, by the way. And, people giving similar ratios. There's a lot of talk of cannibalism, which China, well, I don't want to, that's a whole side story. There was a lot of cannibalism, a lot of reports of cannibalism anyway. There's indications in the ratio difference. People here, in China, if they think you're going to have a girl, they kill the girl and then they have the boy instead. And I always thought that was kind of like a new fad, but actually that's a historical thing that happens in China a lot, where people look and they have a hard conversation. You know how, like, in America, family gets together and they talk about whether or not they can send their kid to college or whether they can get him a car when he turns 16. In China, they get around the table and they're like, listen, youngest daughter, we're going to have to eat you. Like, literally that conversation. Or, grandma and grandpa, I'm sorry, no more food for you, and when you're dead, we're going to eat you too. That's the conversation they have in China, or have had historically. But they've done studies of the ratio difference, and normally the ratio difference is there's a 0.1% more males than females, because a lot of times they abort their female daughters or they kill them when they're born. They have female infanticide to a certain degree. But if you look at the age group that would have surrounded the famine, it's more like 0.5 or something. It's like 5 or 6 times more. And people consistently reported, look, if they were going to start losing family members, it was the younger daughters first. That's who and then the daughters generally first. And just those numbers right there were putting at the number of girls relative to the relationship to the number of guys would be like 5 or 6 million. But that doesn't even count for the fact that there still would have been a lot of boys who died anyway, so it would be more than that. Like, there's that estimate. There's one thing about statistics. Governments lie about statistics, but in China, then and now, the government of China just... you can't assume that everything is not true, but so much of it is not true that it's very difficult. And when Mao's Rebel News did it, he just took government figures and said, oh, 3 million missing, 3 million died. There's good evidence that they actually keep 2 sets of statistics: the ones that they like, that they put out to everybody, and then the ones that they actually use. There were, I forget his name. Maybe I should look it up. How many deaths? That would be the champ. Kong Jin. Let's see. How many died? Okay. Here's one. I'll just read this a little bit. Blah, blah, blah. Where's a good place to start? Okay. The estimates of American demographers, and just to point out, at the time, very few people had any idea this was going on. China was a closed society, very largely. There were a couple of reports here and there, people saying there was some kind of famine or whatever, but it didn't really come out. It was only in the late 80s a lot of information came out, and a lot of people started looking at it and saying, oh my gosh, there's a famine. But the estimates of American demographers are also challenged by Chen Yizi, that's Y-I-Z-I, and I think that's in the Pinyin method, a senior Chinese party official who fled to America after the crackdown that followed the 1989 pro-democracy demonstrations. After 1979, Chen played an important role in the rural reforms as a member of a think tank called the Tiangaosuo, or System Reform Institute, patronized by Zhao Ziyang, then premier and later party secretary. The new Chinese leadership wanted to find out what had really happened under Mao, and one of the institute's first tasks was to draw up a picture of rural China. Chen was part of a large team of 200 officials who visited every province and examined internal party documents and records. The Institute's reports conclude that between 43 and 46 million people had died during the famine, and several sources said that an even larger figure of 50 to 60 million deaths were cited at internal meetings of senior party officials. The Institute's reports have never been released, but in an interview, Chen recalled the death tolls for a few provinces. I'll just show it. So there we go, and there's Sichuan, that's right, 9 million. Qinghai, 900,000. Qinghai is out west, there's a lower population there. Shandong, 7.5 million. Anhui, 8 million. Henan, Hunan, 7.8 million. So those are just single provinces, each one coming close to 10 million. Those are large. I mean, Sichuan's one of the largest provinces, so is Anhui, so is Shandong. But just those come out to 33.2 million, and that's only 5 of the provinces. I guess, one could say, hey, he was a defector, so he must be lying. Well, he could be, but it's hard to see what he would be gaining. I also want to point out there is another book that I have not read by a member of the CCP, Zhisheng Yang. That's Jisheng and then Yang. The title of that book is Tombstone: The Great Chinese Famine. That was actually published in Hong Kong. I just saw an interview with him, and he said he's in the Communist Party, and he's just thinking, look, we have to admit that this happened because people know that it did, and as long as we pretend like it didn't, we lack credibility. And we have to come clean and be like, all right, this happened in the past, and we're not going to do that anymore. The party is unwilling to do that, I think, because so much of their identity is tied up with the personality cult of Mao Zedong, that to say he made that big of a mistake, which, it's funny, they do have officially said that he has made mistakes. They don't pretend that he's perfect, but they're not willing to say he made one this big. And again, to go to Mao's Rebel News' claims, this is like the biggest mistake you could possibly make. I mean, millions. He says 3 million, but 3 million people died. Like, what? Like, who gets to make that kind of mistake and have any credibility whatsoever? So now, Mao's Rebel News then goes on to berate capitalism, because what about the millions who died in the Great Depression in the United States? Well, I've heard people claim that millions of people starved to death during the Great Depression. Having known people who lived through that and talked to them about it, I have never heard anything like the stories I read about in this book. Like, everyone I ever talked to had plenty of food. I've looked into that, and I have been unable to find any evidence. But the other thing is, even if you did find some starvation, we had a government program to slaughter domestic animals and destroy crops to raise farm prices. So I don't see how that's capitalism. Mao's Rebel News also said, well, what about the famine in Bengal? And I'm not sure where Bengal is, but if he means Bengal, I don't know all the details about that. But as far as I'm aware, that's because the Japanese invaded Burma and cut off rice exports, and then it's also because the British Empire just took took a huge portion of the grain and used it to fight World War II, and just confiscated. And I don't know how that's exactly how the British Empire or the New Deal counts as capitalism, but that was Mao's Rebel News' claim, a very interesting claim. And that Mao's policies clearly work, because there hasn't been a famine in China, but Mao's policies were abolished in the 70s. So how are they still getting the credit? We have capitalism, and we don't have famines anymore. We have fat, poor people is what we have with capitalism. That's the problem with capitalism. We have everything that we want, and we have to deal with the fact that we have these desires. Whereas in communism, we have to worry about which daughter to eat first. So, interesting book, depressing reading, but worthwhile. I'm not going to read it right now. I probably will eventually buy the other book and read that as well. just to get his perspective. But anyway, it's a long video. I'm sorry about that. Any questions or comments, concerns, other famines you know about, other estimates you've heard? I know some of my subscribers are likely gonna, wonder about some of these numbers, and with good reason. There were only 3 official censi in China, even remotely around this period. One well before, one in 62, kind of during, and then one maybe 5 or 6 years later. That makes it very, very difficult. There's good evidence that some of the provinces were keeping very close track of their province, which is problematic because you could have people who leave the province, they're not going to show up in the next census, but that doesn't mean that they died either. So, yeah, I think there's a good chance that somewhere in Beijing there's evidence of a good idea of what happened. We have gotten people who've kind of alluded to that and indicated that it's about as bad as the more broad-ranging demographic people have kind of guessed. But, the jury's out, except to the point that we know it was awfully bad. We know it was nationwide, which means it can't be from the weather. Also, the weather, like, they didn't have bad weather in China or South Korea or in Hong Kong or Taiwan. Every place else seemed okay. Taiwan or Tibet, by the way, never really had famines. They had, their society worked out what was needed to feed the people they had, and a lot of Tibetans think that they were actually targeted for genocide, and they were trying to starve all the Tibetans to death, when really everyone was starving to death, and just the Tibetans suffered greatly. Now, there's actually, the Dalai Lama is the #1 religious figure there. Everyone knows about him. #2 is something called the Panchen Lama, and he's still in China, and he basically wrote a letter to Mao, and he said, this is genocide, you're killing all the Tibetans. And he went to prison for that, and he didn't get out until the 80s, and I think he's still around. I'll have to look that up. But anyway, that's it, and I'll talk to y'all later.